Why is it confusing the two maps? Hi, it's wonderful to be here. It's good to see old friends. I think this is maybe the fourth time I've been to Exeter giving a talk. And rumor has it that John is somewhere, John DeBray.
He's already traveling for the PSC.
Oh, right, but did you say you might be visiting? Well, I'll just say the spiel anyway. And a shout out to John, because I was thinking about, he went to one of my first professional talks in 1989, okay, a PSA talk. So it's sort of fun. If he's here, hi John, a shout out to you. If he's not, well, there's my little hi John. Okay, so this is this couple of caveats. So one caveat is this paper, some of the materials from a paper that one or two papers that Thomas Wright and I wrote. So there'll be a bunch of stuff, co-written stuff with him, and then there'll be a bunch of stuff that's my own stuff, and I won't tell you which is which. No, that's good. Okay, so let's do that. There we go. Okay, so we're going to talk about natural kinds and classification and values, like non-epistemic values. So in non-epistemic values, people usually mean things like social, moral, personal, those kind of values. Now, if one looks at the philosophy of science literature, and outside the philosophy of science as well, the literature on natural kinds, the usual go-to aim of natural kinds and classifications, according to philosophers, is that they're going to serve epistemic purposes. They're going to be used for explanation, they're going to be used for prediction. So this goes way back when, the use goes back to Locke and Mill and people like that, that we want natural kinds because they serve roles in prediction and explanation. And so, for example, there's the go-to stock example that philosophers tend to use, not philosophers of biology, of course, but philosophers of science tend to use about, periodic table, the elements, these are paradigmatic natural kinds. And if you know something's a member of a certain element, let's say you have a piece of gold, you can predict it's going to melt in certain acid, you can explain why it does, and you can go back to its atomic structure. So that's sort of the go-to work of natural kinds for philosophers. And this, the views that I'm talking about, this goes back to Saul Kripke above, Hilary Putnam below, right? This sort of idea of what natural kinds are. Now, these guys, they were writing in the 70s, a little bit into the 80s. And so you might sort of think that this whole sort of epistemic approach to natural kinds, that was back then. Well, it's not just back then. Pretty much in contemporary philosophy of science and philosophy, theories about natural kinds are about the epistemic aims and purposes that they're put to. So here's Richard Boyd, who sadly passed away not too long ago. Probably some of you heard of his homeostatic property cluster theory of natural kinds. The idea is that natural kinds are groups of entities that have a whole bunch of properties that co-vary, but they're stable enough that you can do induction and explain and predict. And then underlying them, there's some homeostatic mechanisms that allow that stability. But again, the whole point there is for epistemic reasons. Then if I go on, let's see who we have next. Oh, there's Khaledi, Muhammad Ali Khaledi. I don't know if you know his work, but again, he's, there's the quote from him, those categories that enable us to gain knowledge about reality. And I'll go through a couple of more. Laura Franklin Hall's work, natural kinds of categorical bottlenecks. And they're, just quickly, what's going on there is that there's different epistemic agents that might have different purposes for getting natural kinds and classifications. When those different agents pick out the same grouping, those are the natural kinds. But again, they're all epistemic agents. And let's see, we have Slater, a lovely slide of him, Matthew Slater. Yeah, I'd like to know what he was using this for, but we just get things from the web. Natural kinds are groups of entities whose properties are sufficiently stable, co-instantiated, accommodated inferential and explanatory practices. So I could go on. I could put up a slide, Chakravarty, Lydian and Ross, Magnus, and so forth. Right. So I believe that point that philosophers of science generally are pretty much into natural kinds being epistemic. Now, on the other hand, Oh, I didn't, yeah, and what comes with that, for some of them, is they buy the value for your ideal, which you've probably heard about, right? The value for ideal, that's been around for a while, late 20th century philosophy of science, is that moral and social, personal, societal, these values should not affect the choice of doing things in science. Whether you're picking theories or whether you're picking classifications. And some of the people who do the natural kind work in philosophy as well buy a version of the value for ideal when it comes to classifications and natural kinds. So there's Calady again, right? He writes, there is a legitimate reason for thinking that some social categories do not track natural kinds when they are being put, at least partially, to evaluated uses. The evaluated uses is when you're using them for a social or moral purpose. Now, the value for ideal, the idea is we don't want our bits of science, whether they be theories, models, or classifications, to be affected by non-epistemic values, because the idea is that would bias them, and that would distract you from the aim of getting truth or epistemically useful classifications. Now, Calady even goes so far as to say this: the use of non-epistemic values in social science is the largest obstacle to the discovery of natural kinds in the social sciences. Earlier in his career, Paul Griffiths said similar things, but he's sort of tempered that a whole bunch since a while ago. Okay, so now a little bit of transition here to the scientists. These are my scientists. So the philosophers don't want the use of non-epistemic use. There are lots of scientists, and I'll give you pretty concrete examples in a few minutes, who using non-epistemic values is important and essential for their choosing classifications or natural classifications as they would put it. Now, so there's sort of a dilemma, there's sort of a controversy here, right? So you have all these sort of philosophers on one hand, epistemology, the reason for classifications, and then I'm going to give you some examples of scientists where non-epistemic values are essential and important in what they're doing. But so you might wonder, what do we do here? We have the philosophers, saying one thing to do, stick to the epistemology of natural kinds and classifications, but then you have people in science who are not doing that. Now, as philosophers, we probably don't want to tell the scientists that they should reformulate what they're doing because they got it wrong, right? I take it a bunch of people in this room as philosophers of science. I mean, there's this idea that, as a philosopher of science, you should be attuned to and respectful for, not necessarily follow blindly, but respectful to what's actually going on in the sciences. And I tend to think there's sort of a good in the natural kind literature that it doesn't incorporate in a systematic way the sort of non-epistemic values that scientists will sometimes use. So I'm not the first one to sort of point out that there are scientific classifications where scientists use non-epistemic values in making selections. There's lots of people, and you can see John is one of the earlier ones there, and lots of people over time. But what hasn't been done in the philosophy literature is sort of thinking out of a systematic account of natural kinds that can pay respect to and use non-epistemic values, right? So this paper is, in part, it's going to talk about how scientists use non-epistemic values, but a big chunk of it is going to go beyond that and give you an account of natural kinds that can deal with that. Yeah, right. So that's what I want to do. Thomas and I have done together, develop a systematic account of natural kinds that includes non-epistemic values as a legitimate reason for picking classifications. So that's all by way of introduction. So there's three things that are going to happen today. So I'll give you those examples. Those are my scientists again. I'm fairly immune to tell, we just, philosopher of science, we just get a picture of people in the lab and we say, there are the scientists. The approach to classification that I want to talk about, this is something that Thomas Reitman and I have developed. We wrote it many years ago, and it will someday be published in the Minnesota volume. And then there's another thing I'm going to do after that. So if you think that non-epistemic values should affect the choice of natural kinds and classifications, then there's the elephant in the room. Is there a British expression? I know a Canadian, the elephant in the room, that American one. Is there a British one? Because there's a Canadian one. It's the moose on the table. Apparently. But we don't. Nothing comes to mind.
The swan in the bird bath or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
What's that?
The swan in the bird bath. Oh, I've just made that up.
That's good.
There's many elephants. It's American.
They probably took that from us.
Yeah. Or I'm thinking it was like the big game hunters, like the earlier President Roosevelt and people like that. They were into getting. You're right, probably earlier here for sure. Okay, so let me turn to some examples of scientists using non-epistemic values when they're doing their classifications. So first example is going to come from conservation biology. And so in conservation biology, you want to preserve, among other things, species, which requires you have to know what a species is that you can identify. And as some of you probably know, there are different concepts or definitions of species in the biological literature. Scientists, it's usually very surprising to people outside of biology, but it's not like there's the one species concept that all biologists agree to and use. So here's a couple of them. This is going to be relevant in the example. There's the biological species concept. That's the one that you might have learned in high school or early college, university. Groups of organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Those are interbreeding species or biological species. And then a more recent, not that recent, let's go back to the 1960s, is the phylogenetic concept, which is based on ancestry. There's many versions of this, but generally it's the organisms that have a common unique ancestor. There's more bits to it than that. They're the members of that species. Now, the relevance for this is in conservation biology, I said they have to choose a species concept to do their work. Now, a side note, I hadn't really thought about it before. I mean, you could have some conservation biologists use different ones in different situations, but interestingly, they don't do that I know of. In conservation biology, what's happened is there's a bunch of conservation biologists that you should use the biological species concept and not the phylogenetic one. And their motivation is not epistemic, but it's because they think that's going to give you the best chance of preserving biodiversity. So how does that work? Okay, so here's a bunch of those authors I was mentioning, which we adopt the biological species and not the phylogenetic species. And they have a couple of reasons for this. They think that if we use the biological, we can preserve more species effectively than if we use the phylogenetic. Here are the two reasons they give. So one is they say the phylogenetic species identifies many, many, many more species than the interbreeding biological species concept. And they argue that, look, we have limited resources. We can't preserve lots of things. We want to go for the species concept that identifies fewer species. That's one argument they give. I'm not, by the way, trying to defend or argue for their arguments. I'm just giving it to you. The second reason, which is actually a little more biologically strong, is that interbreeding species tend to be more viable than phylogenetic species. They tend to be larger gene pools, they have more genetic resources to draw on. So they argue biologically, look, if you want to preserve species, you should be using the interbreeding approach and not the phylogenetic, because then you'll get the kinds of species that will most likely live when you protect them and do things with them to help them. Now, it's important to point out that their choice in using the biological species concept is not because they think it represents the world better than the phylogenetic, right? They see that both, highlight different groupings of species in the world, and they're not saying one is inferior epistemically over the other. They're just saying that, look, we have this aim, this non-epistemic aim. We want to preserve species for biodiversity, and we think the biological species concept will hasten our ability to do that, whereas the phylogenetic will detract. Okay, so that's one example. Interestingly, what? Another example, and again, this is going to be with the species concept as well, and this is about human health and malaria. And so there's a different biologist I'll mention in a minute whose interest is figuring out how we can differentiate mosquito species such that we can better identify those species that carry the parasite that causes malaria, right? And so the interest there is like promote human health. Now, this biologist, there's his name, Attenborough, he argues the phylogenetic species is better at doing that than the biological species concept, right? So we're going a different way here, right? The previous biologist said use a biological species for conservation. He's saying, look, for the purpose of human health and malaria eradication, you should use the phylogenetic. And then he's got this biological reasoning behind it, namely that it gives us a more fine-grained taxonomy that we can identify cryptic species than the biological, right? So he's opting for that, right? So a different value, a different idea about how organisms are grouped in the world in the relevant way. Okay, so those are examples from biology and species, areas that I'm pretty familiar with, but let me go out to the human sciences and give you an example there where this occurs. And as you might, of course, know many of these examples, but I mean, it's sort of obvious that non-epistemic values can affect areas of the human sciences, and we're sort of very familiar with that. But just to put an example on the table, so some of you might recognize her. So Sue is a former PhD student of mine. So she has this paper on, well, you can see the title over there. So how non-epistemic values can be epistemically beneficial in scientific classification. And her case example there is infantile autism. So now we're into psychology, medicine, that area. So just briefly what the example there is, a very, very brief history, but again, to give you an example, on non-epistemic values and classification in science. So infantile autism, I guess, was recognized around the 1940s. I forgot the person's name, Kaplan, or that doesn't matter. And the initial theory was a psychological theory, and unfortunately, it's been called the refrigerator mom theory, because the idea is that the kids that were autistic at that age, they were being brought up by smart but very cold parents. And I could go on from that, but I won't. But so they ended up getting this name, the refrigerator mother theory. Right, and this was a rather nasty theory for families. They had these children, right? Because the parents were, not only did they have a child, they had to deal with certain things, but then they had society having to deal with them because they were being told that they were bad parents in some way. So in the 1960s, another psychologist, Bernard Gremlin, he thought that these parents, these families were getting in a really bad shape, given this labeling, given this theorizing of the cause of autism. And so because of that motivation, because he thought people were being unethical to these families and these parents, he thought, no, we have to rethink this. And so he did. He started working on it. There was a faint but not well-developed neurological theory for infantile autism, and he investigated that. He figured that empirical information for the refrigerator mom theory was not as good as people said, and that his neurological theory was stronger epistemologically, and it caught on, and it's pretty much the theory we have today among psychologists about the cause and what infantile autism is. Now, the example here, again, is supposed to show you that the scientist was initially motivated for non-epistemic reasons, and then went and did this work on classifying individuals should fall in a category of infantile autism. So the values come in there in a different way than the conservation or the malaria case, but nonetheless, it's coming in there. Okay, so stepping back from these examples, we get my caricature scientists. Right, so we have, this problem in the literature on natural kinds and scientific classification, all about epistemic virtues of such things. Scientists, on the other hand, many of them, obviously not all of them, think that non-epistemic values come in, and those examples can be repeated. So, where do we go? So, Thomas Wright and I, we developed a different account of natural kinds that would include non-epistemic values. And so that's what I want to go to now. Now, this account that Thomas and I developed, that'll eventually be in the Minnesota studies, we didn't initially develop it because we were worried about non-epistemic values. What we were worried about is it seemed that the diversity of epistemic reasons that philosophers talk about for natural kinds are much more narrow than some scientists have. So if you saw from the earlier examples of the philosophers, they talk about things like prediction, explanation, and causal homeostatic mechanisms. But on the other hand, there's lots of scientists who do other things with classifications. So microbial taxonomists, they just want stable, non-causal classifications, just so they can re-identify. So initially we developed this to sort of allow greater range for epistemic purposes for classifications in natural kinds. But more recently, we sort of figured out, oh, this account is sort of set up to allow the incorporation of non-epistemic. It's not an account that's wedded to just the epistemic. So I'll give you a brief intro to this account. And again, others have recognized that non-epistemic values affect classifications in science. That's not new. But there's not really a systematic account out there that incorporates the use of non-epistemic values in it. That's what's new. So a couple of you have seen this before. Right, so we have this thing, not the funnest name, the grounded functionality account of natural kinds. And it places two constraints on natural kinds, functionality and grounding. So let's go through those and go through an example. So the functionality account is pretty clear cut, and I mean, I assume it's non-controversial in any way. It's just basically you want a classification to satisfy the aims posited for it. And, so what we do here, by the way, which is really important, is whereas you get something like Boyd or Kaladi, what's the verb of a classification? It's for, I'm not sure what I should do.
Just
Modern problems.
Sorry, Mark, if you want to continue talking in the meantime, and
Sure, I can say, there's one thing I was going to say about this thing is, right, so here it's open-ended on the function for the aim of classification, where if you go to people like Boyd's, Kaladi, and standard philosophical account of classification of natural kinds, it's not open-ended like that. It doesn't go into the science and say, what's your aim? Let's see if it's satisfied. They just say, look, we don't care. The aims of science is induction and prediction, explanation. There's no variability. Oh, excellent, magic. Magic for me. Okay, so the grounded functionality, that's the functionality part.
I could see it.
It's pretty simple. Okay, so then the other purpose, the other criteria, the grounding requirement, its motivation is to follow in the tradition of philosophers that wanted our account of natural kinds or classification to get natural kinds or real kinds. Now, recently in the philosophy of science, natural kind literature, the word natural has become sort of spooky. Actually, that's interesting. Oh, because this is a PC and I did this on a Mac, I have the natural word in the real world in real Halloween-like font. So you don't quite see it, so you don't get that. But I'll represent that to you. Right, so a bunch of people say, what's natural? It doesn't matter. It's too contested of a term. Don't use that word. I think those concerns are a little bit blown, but I'm not really going to go into that. And I'll say that the grounding condition is trying to get us that realist natural element to natural kind theories. But I won't digress on that here. But here's the grounding condition. We should have a good reason, well supported if feasible, to believe that the chosen classification of kind satisfies the functionality requirement, because that classification is getting something right in the world. Right, so it's not saying, I mean, it's a funny sort of thing. The constraint on a well-supported yet defeasible hypothesis is not about the grouping itself, but that it satisfies the function of getting that grouping. That's where this sort of natural real bit is coming in, that grounding is coming in. Let me give you an example. It's really not that complicated. So going back to biology and biological species concept, right, so proponents of that concept, what they want to do is they want to highlight something called evolutionary units. I was very good at that one. It's very controversial. But they think species should be evolutionary units. And it goes back to Darwin. And they think, these proponents, that we can identify which groups of organisms are evolutionary units if they're groups of organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Because the idea is they share traits and evolve together, giving them some sort of unity. Okay, so how does this work when we turn to the grounded functionality account? Okay, so there's two parts. Let's see how it fits there. So suppose the biological species concept succeeds in its aims, it does produce classifications of groups that are evolutionary units. Well, it arguably it does do that according to those proponents. And then we go to the second part, so it gets that function. Suppose you have good reason to believe the biological species concept passes the functionality condition because it's getting something right about the world, namely that interbreeding causes evolutionary units, right? So it has a sort of hypothesis, the groups that interbreed, they evolve as a unit, and they have empirical information for that. So that gives it the grounding. Now again, it's defeasible, it's reasonable, within reason, that kind of inference you're making. So that, in its bare bones, is the grounded functionality account. But there's a bunch of clarifications I should get before moving beyond, just to be a little clearer what's going on here. So, first clarification, that we may have been very ill-advised in choosing the word grounding, because there is this in analytic metaphysics, there is this notion of grounding, which is sort of a reductive notion that sort of bigger things exist and can, the facts about the bigger things can be explained by facts about the smaller things, tables and its microstructure. So it's not that. We're not doing the analytic metaphysics notion of grounding where we just a priori sort of analyze what things are. No, I mean, what we're doing is we're saying, look, when people do a classification, they make an assumption about the world. Maybe they want evolutionary units. Maybe they want something that's easy to preserve, biodiversity. Maybe they just want stable classifications for microbial health research. If we have reason to believe that those classifications are successful in their aim by some evidence we get in the world, that satisfies the grounding requirement. We don't digress at all about the confirmation theory of how that works, because that's a whole other area of philosophy of science. Now, this one, right, so we developed it for obviously science ones, and you can see the examples I've been given here are science ones, but it's intended to apply beyond science, classifications outside of science. The idea is that, these other types of classifications, we can call them that, if they pass the functionality and the grounding requirement, then we think, oh, okay, that's a natural classification or natural kinds. Now, I haven't worked on examples of that or worked it out, so there's a bit of an IOU there, but that's the intention. One of the things just to point out about the word natural, going back then, but also here as well, it's not like philosophers are hung up with the idea of talking about natural kinds. There's lots of biologists in taxonomy. In fact, it's the common phrase. They're looking for natural classifications. So it's not like us imposing upon our science friends. Okay, another, right, so the whole reason giving you this account of natural kinds today was to say, look, it fills that lacuna in the natural kind literature. It allows a way that natural kinds, we can evaluate photosynthesis of natural kind when those natural kinds are posited or classifications are posited for non-epistemic reasons. Because the functionality requirement and the grounding requirement can easily go to non-epistemic. So if you're a conservation biologist and you want to preserve biodiversity, you want to pick the species concept that best does that, that's your aim. And if you have then biological information, facts on the ground, that one particular species concept is going to do a better job at reaching that aim than the other, then we can call that a natural classification. And yeah, okay, so one other caveat, if John was here, if he's not here, there are similarities. So, I mean, John has been very nice to me. I mean, he refereed one of my first papers in philosophy of science in the 80s. So I've been highly influenced by him, and we've had a bunch of interaction about this stuff. And I'm very much in agreement with lots of things, not everything that he says along those lines. So there are indeed similarities. Okay, so let's get to the moose on the table. You remember that, right? Remember that is? Okay. So then there's this vexing question. Yeah, fine, okay, sure, natural non-epistemic values are allowed and legitimate in choosing theories, hypotheses, and classifications and kinds. Okay, but which values do we want? You know, is it any values? So you know the values in science literature, this is a big issue to deal with. You know, we don't want certain sexist values or racist values. I won't give you an example off the top of the head, but we don't want certain values, those values, to be legitimate ones in being classifications. On the other hand, you know, if values or non-epistemic values are useful for conservation, for psychology, useful in the sense that they're doing things more than epistemic, but they can also be epistemic. We'll talk about that in a minute. You know, those we might want to consider legitimate. So if you think of some of Alison Wiley's earlier work on anthropology and feminist values there, and how up until the 1960s or so, a lot of archaeological and anthropological literature was very male-oriented, only thinking about men in human evolution and society evolution as well. And there were some scholars in the 60s that said, no, what about the women? They were motivated by feminist values. So there's this background of thinking, okay, if you're going to allow that non-epistemic values affect which classifications you buy, then we have to be able to sift out which one of these. So that's to deal with here. Now, there's virtually nothing in the values in science literature that talks about how to select non-epistemic values for then selecting classifications. The literature on that is found in the more general values in science literature on picking theories, hypotheses, and models. And within that literature, I think there are three main approaches. And people pretty agree about that. But people want to talk about the first one. So my interest at this point is which, you know, if we take all these approaches, one of these approaches, what's going to particularly work here? And so my eventual aim, but it's not done here, is to figure out for classifications what sort of factor is going to be a good one for sorting legitimate, illegitimate, non-epistemic values. So I'm going to go through these extremely briefly, and then maybe talk a little bit about one that I'd like to pursue. So start with the epistemic approach. Now, the epistemic approach, there's a couple of people who promote this view. It's interesting, the talking. Oh, you don't see it there. That's funny. On my screen, it says talking : Celso Neto. I guess because you locked it.
Oh, yeah.
That's why I'm mysterious. Okay, so the idea here, and so Elizabeth Anderson did this many years ago, as a lot of other things that are really important and do work in the values and science literature. That one motivation and one reason for thinking, and this isn't like a sufficient condition, right? Because you could have a non-epistemic value, get you epistemic returns, but you could think it's horribly, immoral. So it's not like the sufficient condition that if you use a non-epistemic value and you get epistemic benefits, then that legitimizes the use of that non-epistemic. So that's why there's sort of this clause in here. Non-epistemic values should be used in picking theories when those values increase our knowledge, so long as they're not morally reprehensible, right? There's that caveat in there. And so the earlier work from On, that's the woman on your right. So that case about infantile autism. So I didn't mention some things there, and one thing that she points out is that Rimland, the psychologist, was motivated to the harm that was being caused by families of autistic children, and was motivated to look for different theories for that non-epistemic reason. And the theory that he came up and developed with other people had these wonderful epistemic upshots, right? It's actually, and that mentioned a case of sexism in earlier anthropology, archaeology. That was another one where there was something was not going right as far as equality and thinking about both genders, binary in that time, involvement in our history led to a lot more information that's useful about our evolution over time. And you can find lots of cases of this. Elizabeth Anderson has wonderful cases about divorce research and things like that. Now, this is a wonderful approach, but it doesn't work it doesn't do any work in the biological conservation case that I mentioned earlier. Because there in the conservation case, right, so one set of biologists said they want to use the biological species concept because it's better for biodiversity. Another biologist said, no, we want to use the other concept because it's good for human health. None of them are saying one is epistemically better, right? Their choice is entirely on non-epistemic reasons. So if I'm looking for some sort of criteria for distinguishing legitimate from illegitimate non-epistemic value use and classification, just saying that it gives rise to epistemic upshot would cut no ice, would be toothless in the conservation case. It's not a bad thing, it's not a tool that works there. Okay, so that's the epistemic approach and pretty much everything I'll say about that at this stage. Then we move on to the moral approach. And so here we have Janet Craney and Matthew Brown, who argue for this case. Excuse me, this approach. Right, so we choose non-epistemic values, the ones that are morally correct. And Celso and I were earlier talking about values and classification. So Matthew Brown, he's got this argument about this hypothetical one where some sociologists found that there's actually, when it comes to race, there's actually differences in intelligence. And Brown argues about how, independent of how that's true or false of the world, we just shouldn't let it out there for moral reasons, because it might cause people to do more harmful things on top of the already harmful things they do when it comes to race. Okay, so this, I mean, moral values are important. I have no problem with this. I think it's great. But a lot needs to be done to work on this in picking out legitimate and illegitimate values affecting non-epistemic values affecting theories or classification choice. So here are some concerns. And they're probably pretty obvious. I mentioned them, and I don't want to give too hard of a time. Different moral theories give different pronouncements, but not always. I mean, sometimes they give the same pronouncement, but sometimes they differ. There might be a utilitarian pronouncement that go with this classification. There might be a deontological one go with that classification. So, right, first it's like which moral theory, which one's appropriate in this case? And I don't want to say it's bunk. It's just that some cases that there may be overlap and there'd be clear direction, and then those cases where it's not. A second problem, I think has a little more meat on it when it comes to sort of what's going on in the value science literature. So one thing that's sort of tricky in the value science literature is, people will say we want to promote, the right values, and they'll talk about things like very grand overriding values like promote human flourishing or promote human health, promote human equality, autonomy, opportunity. I'm not against any of that. Obviously, I wouldn't be arguing against that. But the problem is it doesn't give really specific guidance in many cases. And so oddly, Janet Crane, she's got an example that highlights that, even though she's part of this view. She says, okay, so you got a weapons scientist, right? There are weapons scientists. And so what should she do? Right, she wants to, look at the example. Yeah, she wants to deter aggression and promote global security. So should she work on the weapons that will give deterrence so there won't be nasty, horrible wars? Or should she not work on weapons because by doing so, she's putting things out there that could be more harmful to the world? So there's sort of this problem that a lot of the value science literature, it's wonderful literature. I love the areas playing in it, but it has these sort of boilerplate, nondescript moral aims. So it's got to be sort of refined and more careful for that. And I guess that was a third thing. Oh yeah, this is another thing that sort of bugs me a little bit. I'm really surprised about this. So some of you have read values in science literature, I take it, of course. There's very little of any reference to applied ethics, right? It's like you have the values and science people talking about values. But then there's all this, there's like philosophy of medicine or, not philosophy of medicine, like creating words, medical ethics or environmental ethics, right? There's all these these sub-disciplines where there are philosophers worried about values. But oddly enough, the values in science literature doesn't go there. It doesn't avail itself of that resource. So I find that sort of odd, that this big, the philosophy of science, values and science people don't engage with the ethicists or doing the applied ethics. I think that's a real, maybe there's nothing there to get, but my sense is that there's a lost opportunity that someone and some people should start working on. When I was much younger, there'd be these older philosophers say that would be a good PhD project. I guess I come to that. Okay, so then there's one other area, the stakeholder democratic approach. I forgot Indeman's first name. I don't know Schroeder's either, so it doesn't matter. Andrew, he's Andrew Schroeder. Christian Indeman. Right. So they think we should go to see what the relevant stakeholders' values are. And you probably said a version of this. And stakeholder is someone who's going to be affected by the research or the medication or whatever it might be. So we're obviously talking about humans as the stakeholders. Though I guess some people would argue for non-humans as well in some cases, but I won't go down that alley. Right, so we should have the relevant stakeholders. Now, one reason I put democratic there, / there, is often the components of this, they say both, they go between the two. And I think the way to think about it is stakeholder might be a smaller group, but then when stakeholder gets really big, then it's more like democratic action. And you need to get democratic opinion, you need to get values selected by democratic groups, right? Or smaller groups, right? It's going to be the stakeholders involved. Okay, so we've seen that view, I'm sure, in the literature. There's some challenges there too. And again, some of these are sort of, you can just figure them out if you're beginning, not to be a philosopher, I was going to say beginning undergraduate philosopher, but problems like, who are the relevant stakeholders? Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not obvious, but it's certainly doable. Right? None of these are fatal in any way. Right, as you well know, there's cases where stakeholders have conflicting values, and for better or for worse, this often comes when you have economic agents who have certain corporations have certain values, and then there's the people who use the products or are affected by the products. Right, lots of cases of that. So, which stakeholders' values do you buy? It was sort of fun. I had an MA student who, talking about the industry values and, how those philosophers tend to, the examples usually industry values are always cases where the industry has the bad values. And so she was sort of motivated. Amanda, do you know? Yeah, she was really, it was an honors thesis. She was undergrad. She was really good. And she was like, well, wait a minute. I'm gonna look in businesses and industry. I'm gonna see if they have, good code of conduct, and they might have values that we don't automatically as philosophers poo-poo. And she did. It was a really good thesis, and it was really nice. The contrarian was really good because it came up with information that we just don't normally talk about. Anyway, so there's the conflicting values, and then, right, this is another one you probably have heard about, and lots of people have written on this. Philip Kitcher did lots of work, 2 books at least, how you want stakeholder democratic input on science, non-epistemic values, but there's this technology problem that the people who are affected don't have the technical knowledge, and how do you work that out? And that's something that people are working out. It's not, we don't have that off the table. Now, for my own, I sort of like the stakeholder approach, and that's something that I would work on. And there's a couple of reasons I like it and want to promote it, and why I think it might be tractable. I mean, one thing, it has a social good, and namely that by getting stakeholders' values, it gives us a certain kind of stakeholder engagement, which I think can do a good measure in promoting trust in science. So this whole literature about trust and doubt in science. And there's people who talk about engagement as being really important for getting trust in science by non-scientists. So I think there's sort of a side benefit, an important side benefit from the stakeholder approach. And certainly, I mean, it's not like, when you get people a lot more engaged there than, let's say, if you're using moral approach. Another thing I like about the stakeholder approach is it doesn't have to be done in the armchair, right? You can actually, I mean, it's going on right now. I mean, the social scientists, it's been going on for a number of years, who study cases of stakeholder input, right? And because there are such studies and there's such work, you can see best practices, right? So it's not like armchair philosophy or armchair intellect, anything. Instead of speculating how this can go well and how we should do it, there's actually social science work on this. So that's a big positive in my mind. Okay, so I've run through a lot of things here. And so I'll just end with a little summary and thank you stuff. Okay, so there's first part of the talk, motivating the whole idea that the scientists using non-epistemic virtues, philosophers do not key into that for the most part, and that we need to if you're worried about classification in science. And then I talked about an account that I developed with Thomas Ryden that we think can fill that void. And then the last one was the moose in the room conversation. Here, I didn't so much have anything I was arguing for, really, but just sort of telling you this is sort of what needs to be worked on next in this kind of project. So that's my, I have a thank you slide too. So that's my talk. Thanks for being here. It's wonderful to be here.